How's it going, everybody? This is Mr. Gregory. This is my first video lecture. Today we're going to talk about England in our Age of Absolutism unit. So we're going to revisit King Henry VIII, who we've talked about before. We're going to talk a little bit about Queen Elizabeth, who we've talked about before, but not so much. And we're going to move on throughout the lineage and talk less about the Tudors, which is Henry and Elizabeth, and more about the Stuarts, Charles and James and such. Okay, so one of the first things we're going to talk about is Parliament. And no, I'm not talking about the brand of cigarettes. I'm talking about a legislative body. What is Parliament? Well, in America, we have Congress. Congress is our legislative branch, and it's meant to represent the people. In England, they have Parliament. Now, unlike our Congress, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, England has Parliament, which is made up of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It's a little different, okay? The House of Commons is meant to represent the average people, the peasantry, whereas the House of Lords is meant to represent royalty and nobility. So it's a little different from our system. That said, it's basically their legislative body. Okay. Under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, Parliament always had a say as to what was going on in England. All right? Despite their absolute power, meaning they could do whatever they want, there was no limit to their power, Henry and Elizabeth always consulted Parliament. If they needed war funds, the Act of Supremacy, which we talked about, which gave King Henry VIII the right to be the head on earth of the Church of England, that came from Parliament. That wasn't Henry doing that himself. Even though he broke away himself, Parliament gave him the power to be the head of the church. And so forth with every other monarch. Okay. Henry and Elizabeth also have a loose belief in that divine right of kings we've been talking about. Remember, the divine right of kings is that your right to rule comes directly from God. Okay? That's a little bit different from what Henry and Elizabeth were believing. They didn't cling so heavily to the idea, or so strictly to the idea, that they had absolute power and that came directly from God. Okay. Now, after Elizabeth's time, we're looking at a man called King James I. Okay? When Elizabeth died, the heir to the throne was the Scottish monarch, King James I, Scotland obviously being the neighbor to the north. Now, James was the opposite of Henry and Elizabeth. He had a firm belief in the divine right of kings. He didn't think Parliament should be able to challenge his authority. All right. James would often fund wars by dissolving Parliament, literally getting rid of Parliament and collecting taxes himself. So instead of getting Parliament to pay for things, he would just get rid of them and run things himself, raise taxes himself to pay for his wars. Okay? James also feuded with Puritans who wanted to sort of purify the church and make it a little more democratic, but James refused. Okay? Along comes his son, King Charles I. Charles takes over in 1625. He's very similar to his dad, James I, who we just talked about. Charles asked Parliament for war funds in 1628. But Parliament said, you can't just bring us back when you need money. So Parliament refused to give Charles the money until he signed what was called the Petition of Right. The Petition of Right prohibited the king, in this case Charles, from raising taxes, without Parliament's consent, or from jailing somebody without justification. So in this time of absolute monarchs, the Petition of Right would have limited Charles I's power. Charles signed the petition, and then he dissolves Parliament anyway. But it was a sign that the people were not happy with Charles abusing his power, and the people wanted more say in their government. All right. So in 1640, Parliament returns. They're summoned for money once again by Charles I. Parliament at this time revolts against Charles. Some of Charles' ministers were captured and executed. Parliament tried to abolish bishops, try to get more democracy in the Church of England. They declared that the king could not dissolve Parliament as he had done before. This became known as the Long Parliament. This rebellion against the king was known as the Long Parliament, and that happens in 1640. This is going to lead to the English Civil War, which is going to last from 1642 to 1651. Why is it significant? Well, if you forget everything else about the English Civil War, the most important thing is that the English Civil War symbolized the first mounted challenge to absolutism that we ever really saw in Europe. The people were rejecting the king, in this case Charles I's, absolute power. And that's what the English Civil War is all about. On the one side, you had the Cavaliers. They supported Charles I and the king. On the other side, you had the Roundheads, and they supported Parliament. The Cavaliers tended to be wealthy nobles who were also skilled swordsmen and duelers. The Roundheads were country gentry, peasants, regular people, merchants, Puritans. General Oliver Cromwell, his army of Roundheads, defeats the Cavaliers, and by 1647 they capture King Charles I. Charles I is executed. Well, who cares? This is history, right? People get executed all the time. Well, this is what's really important. Make sure you're taking notes. Charles is the first ruling monarch to be tried and executed by his own people in Europe. That is the first time that ever happened. Why is that significant? From this point forward, no ruler could claim absolute power in England. Charles I literally lost his life for that by saying, I have absolute power, you can't touch me. The people said, yes, we can. We want to limit your power. That results in the English Civil War, and Charles I is executed. The guillotine and all. Okay? The English monarchy is dissolved. No more English monarchy. And a Commonwealth Republic is now established under Oliver Cromwell. It's not really much of a republic. Cromwell says he takes the people's voice into consideration. He doesn't really. Cromwell was pretty boring. He was a Puritan. He discouraged lots of fun activities. People are really going to hate Oliver Cromwell for his leadership. Not so much that he led the Roundheads to victory, but really for his leadership later on. Let's talk about this English Commonwealth that Oliver Cromwell sets up. First thing that Oliver Cromwell did was he punished rebels, such as supporters of Charles and Irish Catholics. He pushed for a Puritan society to purify the church. He said all English citizens must be Christian. All English citizens must read the Bible. All English citizens must observe the Sabbath day, which is Sunday. And he strongly discouraged immoral activities. He even banned theaters. Now, the theater is not necessarily immoral, but it was associated with immoral activities for better or for worse. What you got to remember is that even though Cromwell was unpopular and people didn't like a lot of the Puritan things that he did, there was a lasting effect of Cromwell's Puritanism on England that remains to this day. Puritan morality, a Puritan type of republic government, and Puritan education still remains in England to this day. Being very proper, not really letting your guard down, stiff upper lip, those kinds of things remain in England, and that's sort of the Puritan legacy. People really hated Oliver Cromwell for this, and his time as Lord Protector came to an end. After he died, he was hung just to make sure that he was dead. The English people, like I said, they were happy that he was able to lead the Roundheads to victory and overthrow Charles I, but they didn't like his leadership so much. Why didn't people like Cromwell's leadership? Well, the reason is really because he was incredibly strict. And people, when they have nothing to do, want to go out and have fun. This is after the Renaissance, after all. And Cromwell's leadership restricted fun in a lot of ways. It restricted discretionary time for people. Well, England didn't really learn from their mistakes, and after a little bit of Cromwell and no king, they kind of realized they want a king again. So in our next lecture, we're going to talk about Charles II and his reign. Well, I've had enough, so now it's your turn. I want you to answer these 5 focus questions. Number 1. What was the Petition of Right, and what caused the English Civil War? What is the significance of the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I? What were the lasting effects of the English Puritan Commonwealth? Finally, why was Cromwell unpopular? Anyway, it's time for me to eat dinner. I'll see you guys later. Woo!